Let's start this video with a bit of a game. Which two aircraft first come to mind when I say Allied bombing campaign in Northern Europe, World War II? I am willing to bet that it's these two, isn't it? The Boeing B-17 and the Avro Lancaster. I mean, you might be one of those types who says, actually, it's the B-24 and the Hampton. But be honest, it's probably the Lanc and the Fort. These two types do get the lion's share of the kudos when it comes to the bombing campaign against Germany. And that, to be fair, is because they did a lot of the heavy lifting during the fighting. But it does mean their fellow bombers, often excellent aircraft in their own right, can get overlooked. And surprise, surprise, I want to look at one of those aircraft today. The first, in fact, of the Royal Air Force's heavy four-engine bombers to see service during the war, the short Stirling. The origins of this aircraft can be partially attributed to Hitler's boasting. In March 1935, a delegation from the British government travelled to Berlin to make a rather weak protest over Germany beginning open rearmament in violation of their commitments under the Treaty of Versailles. In amongst all the huffing and puffing and bluster, Hitler apparently said that his brand new Luftwaffe had equal striking strength to the Royal Air Force. Now this was, to put it mildly, something of an exaggeration. I know, Hitler exaggerating, you must be amazed. But he did have a bit of a point. At that time, Britain's main heavy bomber was the rather archaic yet new Handley Page Hayford, while the Germans were actively developing the Junkers Ju-88, a far more formidable aircraft than the Hayford, though it would ultimately amount to nothing. Regardless of all of this, Hitler's boasts were enough to persuade the British that it was time to get serious about their own preparations for war. And in July 1936 they formed Bomber Command, which would have the job of taking any future war into the heart of Germany itself. And as they had a shiny new command, they needed a shiny new bomber to complement it. This would be bigger, faster and far more powerful than anything else in British or German service at the time. The specification drawn up, B-12/36, was ambitious. The new aircraft would need 4 engines and be able to deliver an 8,000-pound bomb load to a target 3,000 miles away, i.e. Berlin, as well as be able to carry a maximum bomb load of 14,000 pounds to closer targets. The specification also asked for some other capabilities to be included, but were later dropped, principally that the aircraft have the ability to carry troops. This was not an unusual feature in British aircraft through the 1920s, where they could perform double duties as bombers and transports in Britain's wide-flung empire. The idea was abandoned when it was recognised that for a war against a first-rate power like Germany, the British would really want a dedicated aircraft without the sort of design compromises necessary to make it multi-purpose. Similarly, the requirement that the new aircraft be able to carry torpedoes was also dropped when it was found that designing the bomb bay to accommodate them was overly complicating the aircraft, plus the fact that RAF Coastal Command thought such a big aircraft would be prohibitively expensive to buy and operate. Instead, they requested the development of a dedicated but much more modern aircraft to serve in the shore-based torpedo squadrons, which ultimately resulted in the Bristol Beaufort. While this was a solid aircraft that did well in the war, I must admit the thought of Stirlings being used for long-range maritime attacks, especially in somewhere like the Pacific, is an intriguing one, but very much consigned by reality to fiction. Also dropped was a somewhat more eyebrow-raising idea, that the new heavy bomber be capable of being catapult launched. The idea of shooting off a fully laden heavy bomber, even if the catapult is just providing assistance, means that the airframe would have to be massively strong, and the reasoning for this requirement, being in the initial spec, ties into one of the controversial aspects that surrounds the Stirling even to this day, and which I want to address immediately: its wingspan. The requirement demanded that the new aircraft, which would become the Stirling, must have a wingspan no greater than 100 feet wide, and Schultz would duly build the Stirling with a wingspan of 99 feet, though their initial design proposal would have seen the aircraft have a wingspan of 112 feet. This has led to a widely repeated piece of historic law about the Stirling, that this was imposed so that the new aircraft could be accommodated in the RAF's standard hangars of the day, and this would significantly impact the Stirling in service as it limited its service ceiling, putting it right in the worst concentrations of Germany's flak batteries. As a result, the decision to limit the size of the aircraft's wingspan simply because of the need to fit into hangars is often seen as a major mistake that had significant impacts on the aircraft's combat survivability. In fact, the limiting of the aircraft's wingspan had nothing to do with hangar door size. The standard hangar that the RAF employed at the time had doors 120 feet wide, which would also comfortably accommodate the later Lancaster bomber, which had a wingspan of 102 feet, and plans were already being put into place for even bigger hangars to become standard for future aircraft. Instead, the reasoning for the decision had more to do with transportability and airfield size of the time generally. Firstly, the British Air Ministry had the sensible idea that the new heavy bomber, which no doubt would be getting damaged a fair bit in a war, should be capable of being broken down into sections suitable for transportation on the standard British rail wagon. Naturally, this requirement imposed restrictions on how big those components be, but it would allow new and complete sections to be speedily transported to airfields so that aircraft could be got back into service as quickly as possible, while the damaged sections could be returned to the factories for repair or component recovery with minimal delay. The other factor was that in 1936 the Royal Air Force was in the process of rapid expansion, which meant that there was limited space on their existing fields, many of which were still grass and not paved. This led to two complications. Firstly, as pointed out by Pino Lombardi in his book Short Stirling, the first of the RAF heavy bombers, there was pressure on the RAF to use their existing facilities and not expand their airfields too much. This was due to much of the ground surrounding the then existing bases, and which would be required for any expansion, belonging to important members of the landed gentry, who were often members of the government. They, somewhat understandably, were not keen on their land being taken away from them, and so, with plenty of political clout, the original specification was largely intended for the new bomber to use what was then available. This explains both the need for catapult assisted launch, because it was recognised straight away that the new aircraft would not be able to get into the air fully loaded off many of the airstrips available, and the limitations on the aircraft's wingspan. As pointed out by Colin Spiniot's book The RAF and Aircraft Design, Air Staff Operational Requirements 1923-39, the RAF had already had bad experiences with some types with larger wingspans, mainly with taxiing accidents, and with the prospect of being limited to existing fields, the need to keep the new bomber limited in width was also necessary. In fact, as things got more and more fraught with Germany, by 1938 the realisation was reached that the RAF's bases would need to be considerably expanded and ideally paved, and the necessary land reacquisitioned despite the wishes of the landowners. This meant that the catapult requirement could be dropped, but the wingspan limitation was now set. The initial bid was offered to just about every British aircraft company, though only two would be selected for prototype production in 1937, Schultz with their S-29 and Supermarine's Type 317. And in fact, the Schultz design was selected as the backup to the originally intended choice, the Type 317. Supermarine were the preferred bidder, and their aircraft was expected to be the RAF's new heavy bomber. Unfortunately for them, the death of their lead designer, R.J. Mitchell, and Supermarine's almost complete commitment to building his piece de resistance, the Spitfire, meant that the company gradually slipped behind on development. That left Schultz as the only game in town, especially when the two Type 317 prototypes were destroyed in a German bombing raid in 1940. However, by that point, Schultz already had a production order, with initially 200 being ordered off the drawing board in early 1938. But following the Sudeten crisis and the subsequent Munich Agreement in September 1938, the British really seemed to have begun to appreciate that war was inevitable, and the order increased to 1,500 aircraft, making the Schultz-built bomber the principal intended heavy bomber of the entire RAF. The new aircraft, named Stirling in accordance with British policy of naming their bombers after towns and cities, drew a lot of its design philosophies from that other famous Short Brothers product of the time, the Sunderland flying boat. Aluminium alloys were used throughout the aircraft, and the metal skin was also carefully flush riveted to minimise drag. To further assist with this, both the forward and rear undercarriages were retractable, a feature that was rare on high-performance fighters of the day, let alone on a huge bomber. The mid-mounted wing housed the four engines, which in service would be the Bristol Hercules Radial, which produced between 1,500 and 1,700 horsepower, depending on the model. Defensive armament established what pretty much became the standard for British heavy bombers throughout the war, with two 303 Browning machine guns being mounted in hydraulically powered turrets in the nose and dorsal positions, while a 4-gun turret protected the tail. Early models also had a retractable ventral 2-gun turret, but these were soon dispensed with because they proved basically useless and a poor design, and in fact later models would use other methods to try to protect the aircraft's vulnerable belly, with crews doing things like jerry-rigging 50 caliber machine guns to try to protect themselves. There was another factor that made the Stirling stand out. It was, quite frankly, bloody huge, especially in comparison to its slightly later contemporaries. As this rather handy diagram from Wikipedia shows, the Stirling practically dwarfed the Lancaster and Halifax, aircraft that were hardly small themselves. Building such a prodigious aircraft naturally meant that there were issues. On the prototype's first flight on the 14th of May 1939, the aircraft's left wing brake came on during landing, causing the aircraft to slew hard and collapse in the undercarriage. No one was hurt in the accident, though the aircraft was written off, and Short's lead test pilot, John Lancaster Parker, was seen to savagely kick the aircraft and swear loudly at it before walking away. But it did mean that though the undercarriage would be redesigned to be far stronger, it would always have an evil reputation amongst later service crews, who also complained that the gear looked far too spindly for the huge bomber, a reputation which seems, with hindsight, to be a little unwarranted. Of actual concern was the rapid increase in the aircraft's weight. During the design phase, as modifications were made and new equipment added, the weight of the Stirling went up by about 9,000 pounds to a maximum of 70,000 pounds. When flight tests were conducted, performance was disappointing, with the test aircraft only managing to establish a maximum ceiling of 16,000 feet. But the Stirling was now the only thing to meet the original specification, especially with the abrupt end of the Supermarine Type 317, and that meant performance concerns would just have to be accommodated. Plus, it wasn't all bad news. In the air, the Stirling was extremely agile, apparently amazingly so for such a big aircraft, and that factor would surprise many German fighter pilots in the coming conflict. Indeed, one wing commander used to introduce new pilots to the Stirling by saying, "Gentlemen, let me introduce you to the world's first 4-engine fighter." And there are, in fact, several accounts of Stirling pilots going after German fighters that were attacking other bombers, using their agility to allow their gunners to have a go at them. The Germans certainly didn't want the new heavy getting into service if they could help it. The Stirling's start of production went hand in hand with the surrender of France, and the Luftwaffe, with their bases now just across the Channel, made a concerted effort to disrupt production as much as they possibly could. The potential threat that the big new aircraft represented meant that the two factories that were tasked with building it, one in Rochester in the south of England and the other located at Belfast in Northern Ireland, were priority targets for the Germans. Both factories were hit hard in 1940 and 41, and a number of aircraft were destroyed on the line or while awaiting delivery. This was followed up by raids aimed at the new bombers' bases, though none of the Stirlings were hit in these attacks. Production was also slow as the factories struggled to build up to the huge demands being placed upon them. It isn't generally appreciated that British aircraft companies prior to World War II were specialist manufacturers of high-end precision machinery, often staffed by elite experts and fitters who would basically build their products by hand. In the lower demand years of the interwar period, that was fair enough. But the sudden surge in demand meant that there were understandable growing pains in the industry as it tried to jam its existing staff and the masses of brand new recruits it had been forced to take on in short order into a high-tempo, mass manufacture environment. When that was applied to a particularly large and complex machine, such as the Stirling, well, it meant things were slow anyway, even without the Germans periodically blowing everything up. Plus, things weren't further helped when the British switched demand to building fighters with the fall of France, as it became apparent that they would soon be facing the full wrath of the Luftwaffe, and priority for aircraft grade alloys, engines, and components was transferred wholesale to fighter production until the crisis abated. The huge new aircraft also proved something of a training problem, with crews experienced in handling a four-engine aircraft, let alone one so big, being very scarce in those early days, not helped by the extra problems of inducting large numbers of brand new pilots and crew. All this meant that the numbers of Stirlings was slow to build up in service squadrons, and combined with a thorough training and testing regime to make sure the crews could competently handle their massive charges and uncover the issues that come up when introducing a new aircraft into service, it wasn't until February 1941 that the type flew their first bombing missions. That night, three Stirlings took off, each carrying 16 500-pound bombs, and successfully raided the oil storage tanks at the port of Rotterdam in the Netherlands. This was the start of what were a series of small raids by the Stirling while the RAF built up the aircraft's numbers, with the first raid by the type on Berlin occurring on the night of the 25th-26th of April. Stirlings were also employed in a new gambit, looking to inflict damage on the Germans' defensive fighter squadrons, the circus raids. This had originated by using Blenheim light bombers to attack important targets close to the coast of Europe, who had a screen of fighters operating in support, whose job it was to tear into enemy interceptors if they attacked the bombers. But Blenheims were just too light to do much damage or gain the sort of reaction the RAF was looking for in these operations. However, three of the massive Stirlings, operating in daylight and at ponderously low levels, were much more attractive bait, especially as they could also deliver substantial bomb loads to draw out a German reaction. Though these enjoyed some successes, in normal operations the Stirling was proving something of a disappointment. As said, its wingspan put it firmly in prime target altitudes for the formidable German anti-aircraft batteries, with the Stirling flying operationally at between 12 to 15,000 feet. Additionally, when it had been designed, the largest bomb in service with the RAF was the 2,000-pound armour piercer, and it was with this in mind that the Stirling's bomb bay was designed. As a result, the aircraft had a large strengthening beam running directly up the middle of the bomb bay. This was fine when it came to the carriage of bombs up to 2,000 pounds, but when the British began to field bigger and bigger ordnance, the Stirling simply couldn't cope with them. And though the aircraft was incredibly strong, with Stirlings managing to stagger back to their bases with ridiculous amounts of damage, the delays caused by first the Air Ministry's repeated messing with the specification during the aircraft's development, and then enemy action, meant that better aircraft were not far behind it into service. Just a month after the Stirling made its first bombing raid, another new four-engine heavy, the Handley Page Halifax, performed its own maiden mission. However, despite the Halifax coming into service, followed soon after by the Avro Lancaster, the Stirling was now in full-scale production, including at two new shadow factories. So, whatever its flaws, it was available for the next phase in the British bombing campaign. In February 1942, the British recognised that their bombing efforts, aimed at hitting specific targets, were just not possible with the equipment they had, nor the losses they were sustaining. Thus was implemented the Area Bombing Directive, where the RAF would switch to much larger and more indiscriminate bombing operations seeking to destroy Germany's ability to fight through sheer attrition, by flattening their key industrial cities and transportation nodes. Naturally, this saw the aircraft heavily employed, and Stirlings took part in the first of the 1,000 bomber raids when the city of Cologne was attacked at the end of May 1942. Stirlings would continue to play an important part in the bombing campaign, and the aircraft's tough design meant that it was far from unusual for them to stagger back in a condition that few other aircraft would have been able to survive, with one particular case in note being when a Stirling suffered a head-on collision with a German fighter over the city of Hamburg, but still managed to return to base. This heavy combat employment meant that losses mounted quickly, and two Victoria Crosses, Britain's highest military commendation, were awarded to pilots of Stirlings, both posthumously. Interestingly, the aircraft's comparatively bulky wing, while a disadvantage to the aircraft's ability to reach altitude, meant that there were several occasions when crew were able to cut holes through from the fuselage, clamber inside, and conduct running repairs on battle damage while the aircraft was still in flight. But despite the Stirling's brute toughness, heavy usage meant that its limitations were becoming all too apparent, especially in contrast to the Halifax and the Lancaster. In fact, the aircraft became the subject of a considerable amount of vitriol from the commander of Bomber Command, Arthur Harris. Because of the very limited altitude that the Stirling flew missions compared to the other two heavy bombers, losses were heavier, and for Harris, putting his crew into a substandard and far more hazardous operational aircraft was completely unacceptable. After a raid on Berlin at the very end of August 1943, where the Stirlings involved suffered a 16% loss rate, Harris became far more vocal in his complaints about the aircraft to his superiors and to the government. The Stirling, he claimed, took twice as many man-hours to build as a Lancaster, but had a much higher loss rate. By December of that year, he had well and truly had enough, writing a scathing letter to James Grigg, the Secretary of State for War, in which he said that the units then operating the Stirling were not fit for combat because there weren't enough airframes available to be any practical use, and that there should be the wholesale sacking of the incompetents at Schultz, whose management, he asserted, was run by a drunkard. Obviously, the head of Bomber Command was not happy, nor one for mincing his words. However, though he was justified to be concerned about his crew's welfare and that they got the best aircraft possible for the job, his accusations were not completely warranted. Schultz had always recognised that the Stirling had severe limitations, primarily because of the messing around with the original specification before the war, and had made several improvements and suggestions to try to correct its deficiencies. As the initial Mark I variant with its Hercules engines began production, Schultz had developed the Mark II. This had more powerful American-made Wright Cyclone engines that raised the horsepower from the Hercules' 1,500 to 1,600 horsepower. It was hoped that this would provide the Stirling with slightly better performance and help alleviate pressures on British engine manufacturers. Unfortunately, trials showed that the aircraft to actually be worse than its predecessor, and Schultz went back to the drawing board and came up with the Mark III, which used the more powerful Hercules 16 engine. This did improve the aircraft's overall performance, and the Mark III would be the primary model used by Bomber Command. But it was still far behind its contemporaries, due principally to the limited wingspan. In April 1941, Schultz actually proposed a far more ambitious rework of the aircraft, the so-called Super Stirling. This would have had more powerful steel Bristol Centaurus engines, an operational ceiling of 23,000 feet, a bigger payload, and armament increased to 50 caliber heavy machine guns. But it was turned down because at the time the need for bombers was so desperate that Stirlings were practically flying straight to operational units from the factory, and the thought of disrupting the production line stopped the idea dead. The other reason for Harris's complaint being somewhat unfair was because that by December 1943 the Stirling was largely moving to other duties anyway. Firstly, it became a major participant in the mining campaign that the British were waging in the North Sea to impede German maritime communications, a campaign which gets very little recognition today and for which the Stirling was perfectly suitable. Secondly, Stirlings were finding a new lease in life as transports, especially for covert operations. With their good range, large payload, and nimble flying qualities, the Stirling found ready use in the secret world of the SOE, dropping agents and supplies to resistance groups all across Europe. The Mark IV became the next model on the production line, and this was a dedicated paratroop dropper and tower for glider troops. In this role, the Stirling's size and power really came into its own, and it was the preferred towing aircraft for the big Hamilcar glider, which were famous for carrying oversized items in support of Allied airborne operations, most notably light tanks. The Mark IV was followed by the Mark V, a dedicated transport aircraft, and these did the unglamorous job of trundling around delivering all sorts of cargo to all sorts of places all over the world. Indeed, the Mark V was considered successful enough that towards the end of the war, Schultz decided to develop a model for the civilian market. This, dubbed the Silver Stirling because it was not painted, could carry 18 passengers in reasonable comfort, and Schultz thought to market it to airlines in the post-war era. However, other manufacturers had the same idea and were either converting their old bombers or altering them the same way Schultz were. And just as in the war, the Stirling was decidedly inferior to the competition, so the idea was dropped. Some Stirlings did see use after their careers with the RAF ended, however. The Belgian operator Transair snapped up 10 Mark Vs for bargain basement prices and used them on freight and passenger routes between Europe, Africa and Asia, including running a service all the way to Shanghai in China. 6 of these aircraft were eventually sold to the Egyptian Air Force in 1948. The first Arab-Israeli war was raging and Egypt was under arms embargo, so, desperate for aircraft, they managed to buy the old Stirling transports through a front company. Obviously, they didn't want transports as much as bombers, and so they were converted by the expedient of having holes hacked in the bottom and sides of the fuselage. These provided the ability to bomb by the crew throwing explosives out of the aircraft, and tripod-mounted machine guns used the new side holes to protect it. I mean, I don't suppose they were pretty, but hey, you use what you've got. The reconverted Stirlings were used in several ineffective attacks on Israeli troops and towns, and this proved the last hurrah of the big aircraft. The Egyptian Stirlings appear to have served until 1950 or so, and then they were replaced by, you guessed it, Halifaxes. In total, some 1,759 Mark I and Mark III bombers were built, while another 610 were built as transport or glider towers. According to the best figures I have seen, as their contribution to the bombing campaign, the Stirlings flew 18,440 sorties, in which they dropped 27,821 tons of ordnance. This came at the cost of 641 Stirlings lost in action and another 128 in accidents. Despite their being the first of the RAF's big 4-engine bombers of the Second World War, not a single example was retained, and they were all scrapped. Today, only partial remains of the aircraft exist, generally recovered from the wrecks of Stirlings lost during the war, which is a real shame, because though the Stirling was very much eclipsed by its more famous successors, and continues to be so, it was the first of the RAF's heavies. The Stirling therefore taught critical lessons on the operation of such large and complex machines, which were far in excess of what the RAF had been flying up to that point. Equally, it helped Bomber Command develop its tactics and methodology on how they were going to employ heavy bombers. Absolutely critical information that would form the basis of British strategy during the war. In fact, while there can be no doubt that the Stirling was inferior to both the Halifax and Lancaster, at least some of the success that those types enjoyed should be attributed to the Stirling and its crews, who learnt the lessons the hard way. Lessons and knowledge that those later aircraft would benefit from. So let's not forget the Stirling. It was a magnificent monster, admittedly flawed, but which played its part to the fullest.